think when we think of the Industrial Revolution, we often think of the bigger technologies that were invented, like the locomotives, cars, or even electricity. And we often forget about the smaller, simpler machines that had such a big, lasting impact on society. Effects that we still feel today. And one of those machines would be the sewing machine. Before the invention of the sewing machine, people only had two pairs of outfits, their Sunday best and their work clothes. And while many factors play into this, part of it was because of the amount of labor it would take to make your clothes. If you couldn't afford a seamstress or tailor to make your clothes, you would have had to make them yourselves, often falling on the housewives. The invention of the sewing machine lessened this burden so that they could produce more clothes for their families. For tailors and seamstresses, it made it so they could mass produce their clothing, so they could get a lot more of the same product out there in less amount of time that it would have taken them to do it by hand. Along with this, the less time that it took them to produce the clothes, the lower the price was. So now, people, instead of having to make their own if they couldn't afford it, they could now go and buy clothes. Today, we attribute Thomas Saint to being the first person to invent the sewing machine. Now, in history, they didn't always attribute this to him because his designs were never advertised, and they were only discovered about 84 years later in a patent office. Because he did receive a patent in 1790 for his chain stitch sewing machine that he had invented for shoemaking, which worked on leather and canvas. And we only know this because of William Newton Wilson. Now, he was in the patent office searching up the history of sewing machines because it interested him. And he came across Thomas Saint's patent. So we're not even sure Thomas Saint made this sewing machine that he had patented, but William Newton Wilson did, and this could be seen in the London Science Museum. And he made this sewing machine in 1874 with a few adjustments, and he found that it actually worked. In 1866, William Newton Wilson also produced his own sewing machines, some examples being the Queen Mab and Cleopatra. Now you'll have to forgive me as I pronounce this next name, but Barthélemy Timonier was a French tailor who received a patent in 1830 for his sewing machine, which was a mechanical imitation of hand sewing. Now in 1831, all the tailors and seamstresses were very upset about this because they feared that they would lose their jobs. So they destroyed his workshop. Who would have thought sewing machines could cause a riot? Now, over in New York City, a man by the name of Walter Hunt had created a lock stitch style sewing machine. And he created this in 1832. This was the first sewing machine to use two threads and a shuttle. But he did not patent it, nor did he develop it commercially whatsoever. In 1846, Elias Howe came onto the scene, and he got patents on his sewing machine design. But in the United States, the markets were just not picking up on this sewing machine. So he went to England to perfect his machine. When he came back, he found that a whole bunch of brands had breached his patents. So he ended up being in a lot of court battles over a very long period of time. Now, typically the courts were in his favor because he did have those patents previously. And one of the people he was often in court with was actually Isaac Singer, the inventor of the Singer sewing machine, which is the most well-known sewing machine brand. Isaac Singer patented his design in 1851, and his design included a thread controller and a horizontal surface with the needle hanging over top vertically so it made it easier to work on any part of the project. The success of the Singer Company can be contributed to Edward Clark, who was the mastermind behind the advertising of the Singer sewing machine. And his idea was to go door to door for sales. Now, a fun fact is that the Singer Tower in New York City was one of the first skyscrapers in the United States and was one of the tallest buildings in the world for at least 1 year. Now, earlier I mentioned that Isaac Singer and Elias Howe were in court often in multiple lawsuits. Well, this is what was called the Sewing Machine War, because it wasn't just those two. Everyone was taking everyone to court over the patents because everyone was patenting little parts and pieces of the sewing machine. After a while, they kind of realized, okay, we either just keep fighting each other in court, wasting our resources trying to get our patents, or we could combine in one big patent. And so that's what they did. They had the sewing machine combination or the sewing machine trust. And that is where Howe, Singer, as well as Grover and Baker and Wheeler and Wilson joined forces in 1856 to do a combined patent. Together they merged 9 patents. And so anytime a sewing machine was sold, they would each get a share of the patent money. Elias Howe originally did not want to agree to this because he felt like he had the most to lose. So he made a couple extra deals, and once they agreed to that, he was good to go. And these deals included $5 if sold domestically for every sewing machine, and $1 for every sewing machine sold internationally. Here at the Whitewood Historical Museum, we have 4 sewing machines. The first one I'm going to highlight is the Pfaff, invented in 1862 by Mr. G. M. Pfaff. He lived in Germany at the time, and he actually was an instrument maker. One of his first sewing machines is in the Munich Museum of Science and Technology if you would like to see it. Eventually, Pfaff joined with 2 other sewing machines just because of business purposes, and one of those sewing machines would have been Singer. Our second sewing machine that I'm going to highlight is the Raymond. Now, this was invented by Charles Raymond, and he invented his first sewing machine around 1852 when he was trying to get a patent, but he couldn't because his patent was too similar to the one that Singer had just got. So in 1857, he partnered with Wilfred Nettleton, and they sold their sewing machines for 1/10 of the price of what Singer's sold theirs for. But because of the sewing machine combination, the kings of sewing machines had kind of taken over the US market, and there wasn't enough room for Raymond. So he relocated to Canada, first in Montreal, where he did not see any success, but then to Guelph, Ontario. This move turned out to be the best thing because when the American Civil War broke out, his competitors were affected, while because he was in Canada, he was not as affected. His sewing machines always remained cheaper than those of the Singer Company. In 1897, he retired from the company. Later, the company sold in 1916 to the White Sewing Company. They stopped making Raymond sewing machines in 1922. Our Raymond sewing machine that we have here at the Whitewood Historical Museum was bought in 1910 by Mrs. Victor Bouton from Lamont's hardware store here in town. This was used until 1972. All types of material were used on this sewing machine, such as cotton to heavy woolen cloth for winter coats, paper-thin cardboard to fine silk, and leather, as well as repairing binder canvas. Our third sewing machine is the Eaton sewing machine. Now, this is actually just a model name for a Raymond sewing machine. The cool thing about this, though, is you can tell it's for the economy line of Raymond sewing machines. And how you can tell this is if you find the serial number on the machine, you can see that it has the letter A at the end of the number. And this is what the Raymond Sewing Company used to identify their economy line. So you'll have to come to the Whitewood Historical Museum to see for yourself this little A at the end and see if you can find the serial number. This is a really cool sewing machine because it has a sophisticated mechanism to help hide the sewing machine when you're done using it, or to open up the tabletop to reveal the sewing machine when you are ready for your next sewing project. Your fourth and final sewing machine is the Jones. Now, this one, in my opinion, is the coolest, and I'll tell you why after I give you a brief history. The Jones brothers and Thomas Chadwick in 1859 joined a partnership. They made a sewing machine based on Howe and Wilson's sewing machine designs. But, really rare for this time, they did it legally. So they paid all the royalties that they had to their respective people. Now, Thomas Chadwick left fairly early into this partnership. In 1893, The two Jones brothers then claimed that they had the largest factory exclusively for making sewing machines. So they did pretty well for themselves without Chadwick. In 1879, they then got a patent on their serpent neck model. Now, they stopped making these models in 1909, and we're going to get back to this in a little bit. Jones, unlike Singer, used different names. So they would use CWS, Federation, Whitley's, Universal. They weren't scared to put different names on pretty much the same sewing machine that they had. Ours, however, in the museum does say Jones on it. The Jones name still appeared on sewing machines up till 1980. Now, getting back to that serpent neck model. Now, remember I said they stopped making these in 1909. Well, ours is a serpent neck model. Isn't that cool? What's even cooler is Jones are based out of England. Our sewing machine was actually brought to Whitewood from Hereford, England by Mrs. Charles Sparrow on their immigration to Canada in 1902. So you know which one is my favorite sewing machine, but comment down below which one is your favorite sewing machine. And if you don't know, you'll have to stop by the Whitewood Historical Museum and come and see them for yourself so you can make an informed decision. If you're looking to do more research on sewing machines, there are plenty of good resources online. As always, thank you for joining us today on sewing machines, and be sure to stop in at the Whitewood Historical Museum.